The Senate is gaveling in after a 5-week recess. Senators will spend the afternoon on general speeches. We expect to hear about the resolution for a military strike in Syria, with Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid starting off the remarks. Then at 5 Eastern, senators begin debate on 2 judicial nominations for New York State. Live Senate coverage here on C-SPAN 2.
Let us pray. Shepherd of our souls, the center of our joy, we look to you today for strength and wisdom. Lord, we acknowledge that unless you guard our nation, our efforts to find security are futile. Today, illuminate the minds of our senators with the light of your insights, enabling them to act decisively. As they anticipate the forces that threaten freedom in our world, lead them on the path that will bring life, liberty, and joy. We pray in your merciful name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., September 9, 2013, to the Senate. On the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Tim Kaine, a senator from the Commonwealth of Virginia, to perform the duties of the Chair. Signed, Patrick J. Leahy, President Pro Tempore.
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
I just had a brief conversation. The chaplain, he came down to wish me well in our return. And he indicated that he was going to do special prayers for the Senate in this time of crisis that we have. And I always admire his looking out for us spiritually. And that prayer is for Democrats and Republicans and all of us. And it's really heartwarming to come from him. Not only is he our chaplain, but he's a retired admiral in the United States Navy, having been all over the world in that capacity. So we appreciate him. We don't acknowledge that as often as we should, but I do appreciate his always being available and always being so kind and thoughtful to every one of us. I now move to proceed to calendar 166 S.J. Res. 21.
The clerk will report.
Motion to proceed to calendar number 166 S.J. Res. 21 to authorize the limited and specified use of the United States Armed Forces against Syria.
Mr. President, this evening the Senate will will proceed to executive session and consider a couple of judges, would-be judges, Caproni and Broderick, both from Southern District of New York. At 5:30, then there will be up to 2 roll call votes on confirmation of those nominations, although we may only have 1, but we'll get both of them done today. Mr. President, I just moved to proceed to the joint resolution reported last week by the Foreign Relations Committee to authorize the limited use of force against Syria. This matter demands the attention of the Senate and this country, and it is to this resolution the Senate will turn. Regardless of where senators stand on the merits of this issue, all should agree that we should have this debate. I hope that all senators will support proceeding to this measure. That vote will occur Wednesday sometime on the motion to proceed. Under previous order, at 11 o'clock tomorrow morning, the Senate was to have a motion to proceed to the energy efficiency bill. Of course, it's obvious that we aren't going to be able to do that. I'll work with the Republican leader to reach a consent agreement to defer consideration of that bill to a later time. On the Syria resolution, I intend the Senate should have a full and open debate. I encourage senators to come to the floor to begin that debate. Also this week, President Obama will come to the Capitol to address the Democratic caucus. He's extended this invitation to the Republicans also. I have also, but I haven't heard back from the Republicans as to whether they wish to hear from the President. President Obama will address the nation tomorrow evening. And senior administration officials will brief all senators in a classified setting on Wednesday. And during today, there are going to be other meetings in the White House with senators, both Democrats and Republicans. So, Mr. President, the Senate will give this matter the serious attention that it deserves. Mr. President, the first large-scale military use of deadly chemical weapons occurred almost 100 years ago when the German army deployed chlorine gas during World War I. During that war, we're coming here, and that was a mistake because they haven't gotten all the way down, I guess. During that war, World War I, there were 1,200,000 casualties from attacks with deadly toxins. Chlorine gas, mustard gas, and other terrible, deathly, and destructive chemical agents. Great Britain, Austria, Hungary, France, Germany, Italy, and the United States all suffered losses. This is a horrible weapon, wrote German Major Karl von Zingler, who reported a first-hand battlefield account of the carnage to his superior officers. That's what he said. This is a horrible weapon. 100,000 soldiers died, Mr. President, and most other casualties were debilitated for life by exposure to these deadly toxins. The effects of these killers were horrific. Those that didn't die suffered blindness, burns, blisters, and labored breathing. And for those who died, the end was as terrible as anything one can imagine. The great World War I era poet, he was from Great Britain, named Wilfred Owen, wrote that gas soldiers crowd out like men on fire as they drowned in air thick with poison. The world was horrified by the gruesomeness of these new evil weapons of war. And so, as a global community, we agreed that these weapons should be banished from the battlefield forever. But despite the success of global efforts to eliminate their use, today the Syrian government is the second largest holder of chemical weapons in the world, just shortly behind North Korea. The well-documented use of these toxic and unsavory stockpiles by President Bashar al-Assad's regime is a certain violation of the overwhelming international consensus forged against these weapons nearly 10 decades ago. Mr. President, it's also a clear violation of human decency. But this is not the first time Assad has used chemical weapons against his own citizens. We all heard in our classified briefings a number of times that these have been used. But, Mr. President, this is the most gruesome and extensive. I watched this morning a film in my office. It takes about 13 minutes. Pictures taken following the dropping of those horrible weapons. I will never get that out of my mind, Mr. President. Little baby boys and girls dressed in little colorful play clothes, boys and girls, some look like teenagers, retching, in spasm, arms, and then, of course, older people. But you see, these poisons kill the kids first. Their little bodies can't take this as well as older folks. Kills the older people, but more slowly. So the well-documented use of these unsavory stockpiles by Assad is a certain violation, I repeat, of the overwhelming international consensus forged against these weapons 10 decades past. I've talked about human decency. Mr. President, it's a clear violation of human decency. The August 21st attacks killed more than 1,000 civilians, including hundreds of these children. This week we'll further examine the evidence growing, proving the viciousness of these attacks, and discuss their brutal results. The innocent civilians killed by the Syrian government during those attacks died terrible deaths. Death just as painful and shocking as those suffered in the battlefields of World War I. Death just as terrible as those that convinced the global community almost 100 years ago to outlaw the use of such brutal tactics against soldiers and, of course, against innocent civilians that Assad murdered last month. The evidence of the Assad regime and their using outlawed nerve agents against its own citizens is clear and very convincing. The Syrian government has worked to hide the gruesome evidence. They've done it in a number of different ways, but after the bodies had been cleared away, they sent a barrage of weaponry in there, artillery, tanks, just blasting the ground to destroy any evidence. They couldn't destroy it. It was still there, but they tried. They worked very, very hard to hide these gruesome attacks by repeatedly bombing the site of these grisly, unforgettable occurrences. Without question, this brutality demands a response. Satellite imagery, signals intercepts, and even amateur video shot by eyewitnesses, and I've talked about that, Mr. President, paint a clear picture of the brutality of this awful regime. That is why President Barack Obama sought approval 2 weeks ago for targeted military action that will hold President Assad accountable for these heinous acts. Congress has done its due diligence. Since President Obama announced that he would seek congressional approval for this limited military action against Syria, the Senate has held many committee hearings and briefings, in addition to 5 classified all-members briefings. There are more briefings and much debate to come this week, including open debate here in the Senate. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee, on a bipartisan basis, passed a resolution that restricts the use of military force to 60 days, with a single 30-day extension. The resolution reflects President Obama's proposal for limited military action, including strikes of limited duration and limited scope. And the resolution plainly states that there may be no U.S. military boots on the ground. America's intention, as specified in the resolution, is not to engage in an open-ended conflict or an invasion, nor is the Commander-in-Chief's intention to commit ground troops to this conflict or to effect regime change. The United States Senate will be voting rather to uphold a century-long international consensus that chemical weapons have no place in the battlefield and certainly no place in attacking innocent civilians. This standard demands any government, a dictator or any other government, to have used chemical weapons to be held accountable. Some may disagree with my conclusions, Mr. President. I don't expect everyone to agree with the statement I'm giving here today. But that's anyone's right. But this is my firm conviction. Today, many Americans say that these atrocities are none of our business, that they're not our concern. I disagree. Anytime the powerful turn such weapons of terror and destruction against the powerless, it is our business. And the weapons in question are categorically different. Chemical weapons, you see, can kill not just dozens or hundreds of people, but tens of thousands of innocents in a single attack. Tens of thousands. These weapons don't just pose a threat to the Syrian people or to our allies in the region. They pose a threat to every one of us, every American, and in particular, every member of the United States Armed Forces. If we allow Assad's use of chemical weapons to go unchecked and unanswered, hostile forces around the world will also assume these terrible attacks of demons like Assad are permissible. They're okay. That America cannot allow. That is why the massacres in Syria are our business and our concern, both as humans and as Americans. America's willingness to stand for what is right should not end at its borders. Our intervention on behalf of those in danger hasn't always been popular. Look back at history. There's always been part of our society that prefers isolation. Look prior to World War I. Look, Mr. President, prior to World War II. Some prefer isolation. That's an easy thing to do. But sitting on the sideline isn't what made the United States of America the greatest nation in the world in years past, and yes, today. And sitting on the sidelines won't make us a better nation tomorrow. As America faces yet another crisis of conscience, another opportunity to intervene on behalf of humanity, my mind returns to that turning point in the world's history when the United States of America faced down an evil regime that murdered millions of innocent citizens. Millions and millions of civilians and prisoners of war were murdered by gas in Nazi death camps. Belsen, Treblinka, Auschwitz. Never again, swore the world, never again would we permit the use of these poisonous weapons of war. Mr. President, 14 blocks from here, down Constitution Avenue, is a Holocaust museum. You walk in there and you'll see a quote. It's on the wall. It's from Dante's famous Inferno. Here's what it says, and I quote, "The hottest places in hell are reserved for those who in times of great moral crisis maintain their neutrality." I repeat, the hottest places in hell are reserved for those who in times of great moral crisis maintain their neutrality. I've thought about those words very often, and very often lately, as I've considered whether America should take action to prevent further atrocities in Syria. In Europe, in World War II, far too many were neutral. Far too many around the world were neutral. Far too many in America were neutral. Until, Mr. President, World War II, 6 million Jews and tens of thousands of gypsies, disabled people, gay people, and political dissidents were murdered. Never again? Now we're faced with that choice again. Some say it's not our fight. Some say Syria is too far away. Some say it's not in our security interest. Russia, China, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and the United States, we should all remember our history. 1,200,000 casualties in World War II from these poisons. I'm sorry, from World War I. 1,200,000. We should remember our history. Rabbi Hillel, a respected and famous scholar, said more than 2,000 years ago, quote, "If I care only for myself, what am I? If not now, when?" I, Harry Reid, say, if not now, when? I believe America must set the example for the rest of the world. If America must once again lead, as we have before and we will again, to set an example for the world, so be it. That's America. That's who we are as a country. That's what we do as a country. That's what we stand as a country. That's where we stand as a country. That is the American tradition of which I am proud, and a tradition which I have faith will continue. We are the United States of America. Mr. President, there's an order outstanding that I would ask unanimous consent that the order until 5 o'clock today be modified on the motion to proceed with other aspects of the order remaining in place.
Without objection, so ordered. Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved, and under the previous order, the Senate will be in a period of debate on the motion to proceed to S.J. Res. 21 until 5 p.m., with senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Mr. President.
Senator from Indiana.
Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent to speak to the issue that the Majority Leader just addressed, and I don't anticipate speaking for more than 12 or 15 minutes. I know that the Minority Leader is delayed in being able to be here. I'd be happy to defer to him when he arrived, or happy to defer to someone coming back to talk on the business of the day. But with that consent.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Mr. President, President Obama will make his case to the American people tomorrow, finally, explaining why he wants to take military action against Syria. This explanation is long overdue. I think I have a pretty good idea of what I expect he'll say. First, he'll explain that we have compelling evidence that it was Assad himself who used long-banned chemical weapons to murder his own people. This is not seriously contested. Neither I, nor perhaps I think any of my colleagues here, dispute these sad facts. It's been well documented by our intelligence sources. As a member of that committee, I have had access to those sources, and I don't doubt the conclusion of the President and others that Assad is responsible for this attack. The President will also most likely explain that such a horrendous violation of international norms deserves a worldwide response of condemnation. Who could possibly look at those standards and those rooms full of dead children and not agree that the perpetrators have to face consequences for their crimes? The President also will surely discuss the issue of credibility. He's likely to maintain, as he did recently in Stockholm, that it's not his own credibility at stake, nor even American credibility, but the credibility of the international community that would be harmed by inaction. I agree with those who say that the President's credibility and our nation's credibility are linked. They are. However, with his now notorious and I believe ill-considered red line comment, President Obama has forced us to debate a military attack in yet another Middle Eastern country. Unfortunately, it appears the purpose of the attack, this military attack, first and foremost is perhaps to defend his own credibility. I'm certain that if the President had not drawn his red line, we would not be having this discussion. In that case, Assad's use of such weapons would be roundly condemned as yet another example of his horrendous brutality. But we would be no more eager to engage militarily in his civil war than we have been as the other 100,000 Syrian people were being slaughtered by more conventional means. Make no mistake, it is the credibility issue that has brought us to this pass, and the credibility issue is of President Obama's own making, his and his alone. So tomorrow evening, the President will need to explain to the American public exactly what will be achieved by this limited, focused attack, as described by the administration, beyond a simple token punishment for a horrendous crime and defense of his credibility. The President has said that the proposed limited attack is to be a shot across the bow. His Secretary of State, Secretary Kerry, has said it's going to be unbelievably small. We need to know what the plan is and will be should President Assad be undeterred by this unbelievably small, this shot across the bow attack. What if he isn't? What then? Then what do we do next? The President needs to explain that. We need to know how this escalation is likely to influence extremist radical fighters now active in Syria. Extremist radical fighters. There's not a line between good guys and bad guys here. There's the infiltration of al-Qaeda, al-Nusra, other terrorist organizations and individuals with those seeking to overturn Assad. So it's not clear just how Syria would turn out should Assad be deposed. These extremist fighters, I don't think, will be overly concerned with an unbelievably small shot across the bow response by the United States. What will Hezbollah and Hamas and al-Qaeda affiliated fighters do when this, quote, show of force is over? What is the President's plan of action if the chemical weapons fall into the hands of these anti-American jihadists? And how about the always threatened spillover of the Syria conflict into Lebanon or into Turkey or Jordan? Will an attack intended to slap Assad's wrist while defending Obama's credibility make expansion of the conflict more likely or less likely? And most importantly, the President needs to explain to the American people more thoroughly exactly how America's national security and best interest will be served by this response. The President, in my opinion, must also address additional concerns, which are widely, almost universally, shared by the American people. We all know that taking America to war without support from the people is the surest path to disaster. This, I suggest, must be avoided, and the President is going to have to make his case as to how to avoid that. Over this last week, I visited with Hoosiers from across Indiana to gather their input. Through these visits, as well as calls and emails by the thousands, the vast majority, shockingly majority of Hoosiers I have heard from are opposed to U.S. military engagement in Syria. Like all conscientious lawmakers, I know I have to balance the expressed views of my constituents with my own judgment on how best to represent their interest and the interests of our country. In this case, I must first ask myself, what do the people back home in my home state know that many of the rest of us here in Washington perhaps do not, or at least have expressed? First, the people back home know that America has been at war in far-off lands for more than a decade, 12 years on. They have seen long, repeated deployments of their loved ones, and they have seen the body bags come home. They are aware of sacrifices that have been made in the name of protecting our interests, but they are less aware of positive results of those sacrifices. They see Iraq descending again into conflict as its own citizens continue to slaughter one another because of different interpretations of the Quran or different political motivations or just pure outright quest for power. They see a corrupt government there that authorizes overflights of Russian aircraft bringing modern weapons and Iranian aircraft bringing modern weapons to Syria to fuel a similar conflict. Hoosiers see in Afghanistan so deeply corrupt and ungrateful to the United States that the current regime tries to extort huge ransom payments simply to permit us to remove equipment and personnel from that sorry country. They do not see meaningful progress toward a democratic, stable, and humane government that was to be the objective of American sacrifice of blood and treasure. And they do not see how our 12 years of effort have contributed to our own national security interests. Hoosiers look at the spiraling disaster in Egypt, where the choices have been an extremist, deeply anti-American Islamic radicalism or a brutal and undemocratic military dictatorship, both benefiting from billions of American taxpayer dollars spent on weapons or lining uniform pockets. In the meantime, fellow Christians are being killed in their churches. Simply put, the people of Indiana do not see that American policy and action has attained meaningful results in the Middle East. Instead, they see a region of continuing and increasing violence, chaos, and disintegration. They are war-weary, and they are discouraged that after more than a decade of wars that have not produced the desired outcomes, we perhaps are about to engage in a third. What they don't see is an articulate response. They don't know what our regional security is in the Middle East because no one is examining it, much less pursuing it. They cannot measure progress because they don't know the destination. And they cannot evaluate this latest proposal for a fourth military engagement in the Middle East because they cannot see how it contributes to our own security here at home. More importantly, they worry that a focused, limited attack on Syria will end up being something else entirely because so little thought has been devoted to the potential unintended consequences. Yes, they are war-weary, but the American people are also war-wise. In addition to the above unanswered questions, for me, one of the most important questions is how this proposed limited strike will affect Iran's perception of resolve in our ability to prevent that country from acquiring nuclear weapons capability. It's not so much what we do or how we do it, but how Iran perceives the action that we take. This may be the most significant question of all because, like Syria, Iran poses threats. Unlike Syria, Iran poses threats to our core national security interests. Part of the administration's argument is that to do nothing would embolden the Iranian regime as they pursue their own weapons of mass destruction programs. But I think we have to raise the question, is that really so? Or is it perhaps the reverse? Will a limited punitive attack discourage the mullahs in Iran because of some degree of destruction, remember, unbelievably small, or will it actually encourage the Iranians because there is no follow-up option or broader strategic concept informing our policy? If an attack is ineffective in altering Assad's behavior or fortune, will it not actually encourage Iran in pursuing its own weapons program? I have not heard the administration address this question. A fourth military engagement in the Middle East will make it harder to assemble popular and political support for actions should Iran's behavior make that necessary. My constant fear here during the past several years as I have been engaged on the Iranian issue of pursuit of nuclear weapons has been that our country will be too militarily, politically, and economically exhausted to confront the real strategic enemy when our core interests require it. I fear that a Syria attack will make this problem even more difficult. To my knowledge, no one has yet to address this question within the administration, which President Obama, like the previous three presidents, has declared a nuclear weapons-capable Iran to be unacceptable. I think this is a critical question that we must have to ask ourselves. For all of those who are saying we will change the perception of Iran to the point where they will change their behavior in the pursuit of nuclear weapons by a, quote, unbelievably small shot across the bow or military response that could lead us into further conflict in the Middle East, that this undermines our credibility, I think the question has to be asked, is the reverse going to happen as a consequence of all this? This is a deeply historic and profound moment for our nation. It carries an importance that goes well beyond Syria or even the Middle East. This debate carries important consequences for the relationship between the executive and the legislative branches of our government. To refuse the Commander-in-Chief war-making authorities when he has asked for them is not a decision that any of us can take lightly. We must all balance the views of the people we represent, even when they have been nearly unanimous, with other elements, such as the abstract, unknowable geostrategic factors that could carry profound consequences, not just for this year or next year or this generation, but for many generations. And such as the compelling moral arguments that resonate with special strength in our unique nation guided by birth for moral principles. And now, even the constitutional challenges that could affect the delicate balance we have maintained for 2 centuries. Mr. President, I have been wrestling with, and I will weigh all that I have said, and before I announce how I intend to vote on the resolution before us, I will defer to the President's request to address the nation. In my opinion, consequential actions proposed by the President need to be clarified and numerous questions need to be answered before we grant the authority to the President to engage America into yet another Middle East conflict. Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. say aye. Ms. Baldwin.
And here on the floor of the Senate in a quorum call, I'll let you know that they are expecting to debate some judicial nominations at 5 p.m. Eastern Time and hold a vote on those nominations at 5:30. And an update on Syria from the floor of the Senate earlier. Majority Leader Harry Reid said he blames the Syrian government for using chemical weapons, and he called it a, quote, clear violation of human decency. And he said failure of the United States to respond would, quote, embolden hostile forces worldwide. The Obama administration also blames the Syrian government for the chemical weapons attack that happened last month that killed more than 1,400 civilians. Taking a look at some of Congress members' tweets, and here the action on the Senate floor. And in a quorum call right now, President Obama, he's going to be speaking to both House and Senate lawmakers this afternoon. He's going to be making his case for attacking Syria militarily after a chemical weapons attack that happened near Damascus last month. And looking at the Senate in a quorum call, President Obama will let you know he'll be making his case to the American people on Tuesday night about attacks in Syria. But today, protests being held outside the White House for pro-Assad anti-war protests.
Financed by foreign forces who cannot win without the foreign forces intervening.
And we'll bring you that video in just a moment outside the White House today, pro-Assad anti-war protests. And just to let you know, earlier from the floor of the Senate, Majority Leader Harry Reid, he says he blames the Syrian government for those chemical weapons attacks. and he called it a clear violation of human decency. He said the failure of the U.S. to respond would embolden hostile forces worldwide, and that chemical attack outside Damascus, killing 1,400 civilians. We'll go again, look at this video outside the White House today, pro-Assad, anti-war protests.
Mr. President, I ask that the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection, the quorum call will be vitiated.
Mr. President, I would like to address the subject of Syria.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, I want to commend anyone that is listening to my voice to view the videos that the intelligence community has released. They came from social media. They are 13 videos in excess that came from a body of in excess of 100 videos, but they show the horror of what happens to the human body with an attack by a weapon of mass destruction, in this case, chemical weapons, in this case, a gas called sarin. Mr. President, it is my hope that the President, when he speaks to the nation on Tuesday, that he will show clips of those videos, because I think that very few Americans have seen the extent of those videos, even though they've been shown on some cable shows in some limited amounts. But if they could see the range of why almost a century ago, in 1925, the nations of the world came together in a treaty. This was after the use of chemical weapons in World War I, and this treaty banned the use of chemical weapons anywhere, anytime, including in war, because of the horrific nature that their use causes. That was subsequently, in the 1990s, reaffirmed, Mr. President, in a convention or some kind of conclave where the nations of the world, something I believe in excess of 180 nations, signed banning the use of chemical weapons. And if you will watch the videos, you will see why. You will see what happens to an innocent human being as they struggle for life before the throes of death overtake them. You will see on these videos. And, of course, parents may want to use discretion, because it's going to make a lasting impression. You will see how the body starts to shut down by the nerves being attacked. Now, interestingly, for the first time in a CBS interview today, President Assad of Syria has admitted today that Syria has chemical weapons. Up to this point, that was denied. And no wonder he would want to deny, because when you see what happens in the use of them and what it does to the human nervous system, and I don't want to be graphic because I want anybody listening to what I'm saying to watch them, and I hope the President will show them Tuesday night, to see how the human body convulses, and how when it attacks the nervous system, the convulsions and the twitching and what happens to the face and what happens to the respiratory system and all the evidences that come from that. The American people need to know what we are dealing with, not just in Syria, but in other nations that possess chemical weapons. Not only sarin, which was the gas used here, but also mustard gas and also a toxin called VX that directly attacks the nervous system and does not have to be inhaled like mustard gas or sarin to do its evil deed, but instead can be absorbed, VX, through the skin. And so, if the American people will understand the consequences of the use of this, then we'll understand why it is classified as a weapon of mass destruction, along with biological weapons of mass destruction, introducing some plague among a community of innocents. And of course, the weapon of mass destruction that most everybody recognizes, the nuclear weapons. They're all three weapons of mass destruction: chemical, biological, and nuclear. And that's why in the family of civilized nations, we have said that their use is so abhorrent that civilized humans say that they should be banned. But they weren't. They were used extensively on August the 21st. Now, before I give the unclassified evidence, I want to point out that maybe there is a little opening on the occasion of the Russian foreign minister today having said, since our Secretary of State, almost in an offhanded comment a few days ago, said, well, it would certainly be a game changer if he would allow Assad, would allow the international community to come in and take control of his Syrian chemical weapons. The Russian foreign minister today picked that up. And supposedly there's a comment by an official out of Syria that says that that is worth looking into. I can't speak to the authenticity of that comment. I've heard that it was said, but whatever it is, of course, Assad is the decision maker, and it's ultimately going to come down to him. But in the meantime, what the United States ought to do, and the Congress of the United States ought to authorize what the President of the United States has requested, that the Congress back him in giving him the authority to use a limited, short duration retaliation in degrading his capability, Assad's capability of utilizing these weapons in the future. If the U.S. Congress will give the President that authority, it may well be the additional incentive for the ultimate decision maker, President Assad, to do what the Russian foreign minister has suggested. And that would be a good thing. But in the meantime, we're going to be debating this, and we are going to be put to the question, do we support the president in this time of peril? Well, let's look at the facts. I think when you see the videos, clearly most every reasonable human being is going to conclude that chemical weapons were used on innocents in the Damascus suburbs on the night of the 21st. So the question then, of course, is, well, is there a chain of custody to show that, in fact, that they came from the Syrian army? And there is unclassified a body of evidence that clearly shows, so that, to put it in the speak of the intelligence community, we have high confidence. That means that it happened. So how did that happen? The assessment is that the Syrian chemical weapons personnel who are associated with the chemical weapons part of the Syrian command were preparing chemical munitions prior to the attack. There were streams of data. This is all unclassified. There were streams of data of human signals and geospatial intelligence that revealed regime activities were associated with the preparations for that chemical weapons attack. Syrian chemical weapons personnel, we know, were operating in the Damascus suburb from August the 18th all the way through August 21st, and that was the suburb that was attacked. And multiple streams of intelligence indicate that the Syrian army executed the rocket and artillery attack against those suburbs in the early morning hours of August the 21st. We have satellite detections that corroborate those attacks from a regime-controlled neighborhood to where the attacks landed. And at the same time then, social media reports started exploding about a chemical attack in the Damascus suburbs, and those social media reports started coming at 2:30 in the morning. 3 hospitals in Damascus received approximately 3,600 patients displaying the symptoms of a nerve agent exposure, and they received them in less than 3 hours on the morning of August the 21st. And as I said earlier, there have been over 100 videos attributed to the attack. Many of them, and this has been distilled down into 13 videos, which show large numbers of bodies exhibiting the physical signs of nerve agent exposure. Any member of the Senate will have access to the classified information that shows that the Syrian opposition does not have the capability to fabricate those videos or the physical symptoms verified by the medical personnel. And so when you put all of this with past Syrian practice, some of the small-scale attacks that they had done previously, then the conclusion is obvious that the regime the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad. That regime was witting and directed the attack on August the 21st. So, to this senator, who has had the privilege of classified information, to this senator who has visited with President Assad 3 times, the last time of which was 6 years ago, of which the two of us had a sharp exchange then over what was happening in Lebanon, the fact that he was harboring Hamas and Hezbollah, of which, of course, he denied. To this senator, the conclusion is obvious. There's a substantial body of information that corroborates that it was the Syrian government's responsibility in a chemical weapons attack on August the 21st. There is additional information for the senators to see. Now the question is, are we going to agree to the President's request that we authorize him to attack? Well, if we don't, where does that leave the President on any kind of negotiations in the future? If the President then decided to go ahead and attack, you automatically give to the opponents in these countries, especially President Assad and North Korea and Iran, you give to them the obvious scenario that the American people are so divided they won't support the President. And thus, if he were to decide to attack, that all the more, even though he knows it's his responsibility to provide for the national security, and he has sworn to provide for that national security, and yet we look so divided, at that point, whatever the scenario is to the future. But look what it does in the minds of other people who want to do harm to the United States. Does it give additional license to North Korea if we were to do nothing? And North Korea is sitting on a huge stockpile of chemical weapons, not even to speak of their nuclear weapons. And what about Iran? That we are so very concerned as they continue to energize weapons material as they march down the road, perhaps, to building a nuclear weapon. What kind of message does it send to Iran? And just game that out. If Iran had a nuclear weapon or felt free to use chemical weapons, what that would do to the interest of the United States in that region of the world, not even to speak of our allies in the region, of which there are many. So I think it is clear to this senator. I will admit that I don't know why the President did not keep his own counsel and make the decision without saying that he wanted to come to Congress. But he made that decision, and now it's up to us. Hopefully there may be some validity to this report coming from the Russian foreign minister. But we won't know that for a long while until, as we say, the proof's in the pudding with Assad turning over control of all the chemical weapons to an international body. In the meantime, are we going to support the President of the United States? And I clearly think, in the interest of the national security of this country and our allies, that is a position that we must take. I will vote yes on the resolution. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.
Noting the absence of quorum.